They said I was heartless because I refused to use my honeymoon money to pay off my brother's gambling debt. They called it family duty, like love was a bill I hadn't paid yet. My father said I'd lost my morals, my mother said I'd lost my heart. But the truth was, I'd already spent a lifetime buying their forgiveness with my silence. So when they came for what little piece I had left, my grandmother's legacy, I didn't argue. I simply clicked one button, watched the screen freeze, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty for protecting myself. Access denied. I'm Amelia Clark, and this is how I learned that love without respect isn't family. It's debt with interest. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The morning after my wedding smelled like new beginnings and cold coffee. I woke up in our apartment in Austin, sunlight slipping through the blinds, painting gold lines across the sheets. Daniel was already up folding shirts into our suitcase for the flight to Italy. He hummed quietly something cheerful, the kind of sound that usually makes me smile. But that morning, I couldn't. Our wedding had been small. 30 people, most of them colleagues and friends. No family. My parents said they couldn't make it. Things are complicated right now. My mother had texted the week before, as if absence could be justified in a single line. I told everyone they were sick, that travel was hard for them, and smiled through the lie. Daniel turned to me, holding up a gray blazer. "You think I'll need this for Florence, or too formal?" "Bring it," I said, forcing a smile. "It'll make you look like someone who knows about wine." He laughed, that low, warm sound I fell in love with. "Perfect. I'll fake it till I make it." My phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up Mom. For a second, I considered letting it ring. But habits run deep. I answered. "Hi, Mom." "Sweetheart. How's my newlywed?" Her voice was sugar, warm, familiar. "Practiced. The wedding looked beautiful. I saw the photos online. You looked radiant." "Thanks," I said, glancing toward Daniel. He smiled from across the room. "We're leaving for the airport soon." "Oh, good, good." A pause. I could hear her inhale. "Honey, I wish I didn't have to say this so soon, but Tyler's in trouble again." My stomach tightened. The air around me seemed to thicken. What kind of trouble? "Well, you know your brother." Her tone softened like she was telling me about a child who broke a window. "He was betting again, those online sports things. He says it got out of hand. $45,000. I closed my eyes. 45,000. He's scared, Amelia. The people he owes aren't nice. We're trying to figure something out. But you're good with money, you've always been. Maybe you could help him just a little. Until he gets back on his feet." Daniel looked over. He could read it on my face. "What's wrong?" he mouthed. I shook my head. "Mom," I said slowly. "Tyler's been in and out of this for years. You've bailed him out every time. He never learns." She sighed dramatically. "You've always been so hard on him. He's not like you, Amelia. He's sensitive. And you, well, you're strong. You can handle things." That line again. The one that used to sound like a compliment when I was a kid. Now it just felt like a sentence. "Mom, I can't," I said. "Not this time." Her voice tightened, less sugar now. "You just had a wedding. You and Daniel must have some money set aside for your honeymoon. You could use that. And besides that money from your grandmother, Margaret's investments, that's family money. It's not like it's really yours." I stood, frozen phone pressed to my ear. "That money," I said quietly, "was a gift. And what Daniel and I saved for this trip we earned. That's ours." "Don't be selfish," she whispered, almost like a curse. "He's your brother." There it was. The word, selfish. Every woman in my family's favorite weapon. I swallowed, forcing my voice steady. "Tell Tyler I hope he figures it out. I really do. But I can't fix this for him." The silence stretched. I could hear her breathing, shallow, wounded. Then she said softly, "You've changed, Amelia. Your grandmother would be disappointed." I almost laughed. "She'd be proud," I said, and hung up. I placed the phone down, my hand shaking. Daniel came closer. Tyler again. "Yeah," my voice sounded distant like someone else's. "What did she want?" "The usual," I said. "A rescue." He nodded slowly. "You okay?" "I'm fine." But I wasn't. My chest ached with that familiar blend of guilt and anger, the kind that never really leaves you when you grow up being the responsible one. Daniel wrapped his arms around me from behind. His chin rested on my shoulder. "Let's just go," he whispered. "Italy's waiting." I nodded, but my gaze stayed fixed on the phone. The screen was dark again, silent, innocent. I wished I could believe it would stay that way. As he zipped the suitcase, I thought of my grandmother's voice from years ago. Protect what you build. Even from those who say they love you. When Daniel hugged me tighter, I leaned back into him. But I still felt cold. Somewhere deep down I knew this wasn't the last time my mother would call. The drive to the airport felt longer than it should have. Daniel kept talking about the food in Florence, the vineyards in Tuscany, the hotel overlooking the Arno River. I nodded when he spoke, smiled when I was supposed to, but my mind was miles away. Back in Houston 2 decades earlier, in a house that smelled of coffee and disappointment. It was 2002. I was 17. Tyler had just been kicked out of middle school for fighting again. Mom sat at the kitchen table crying into her hands, her mascara bleeding down her cheeks. Dad stood near the window, silent, looking out at the driveway like it could offer him answers. I stood in the doorway, holding a stack of unpaid bills. Charles, do something. Mom said, her voice breaking. He's your son. Dad exhaled through his nose, slow and tired. He's just trying to find himself, Linda. Boys go through phases. Phases, she snapped. He stole from his teacher's purse. Dad turned away, muttering, he's confused. I wanted to scream, confused. He's cruel, but instead I said what I'd been trained to say. Mom, I'll help figure it out. She looked at me with that strange mixture of gratitude and guilt. You're a good girl, Amelia. You always have been. That line, you're a good girl, wasn't comfort. It was duty wrapped in affection. Later that night, when the shouting had stopped, I found Tyler in the garage, kicking an old soccer ball against the wall. His knuckles were raw. He looked up at me and grinned. Guess I'm grounded for life. You earned it, I said flatly. Don't act like you're better than me. I'm not better, I said. Just tired. He laughed. You sound like Mom. I didn't answer. I turned and walked back inside, the echo of the ball hitting the wall, following me down the hall. My grandmother Margaret lived about 10 minutes away in a small brick house that always smelled like lemon polish and sawdust. She had been a widow since her 40s and ran her own furniture company, Clark & Company Interiors. People in town called her the Iron Widow, half in awe, half in fear. To me, she was just Grandma. She never asked how school was. She asked about numbers. What's the difference between profit and revenue, she'd quiz while stirring sugar into her coffee. When I answered correctly, she'd nod but never smile. Good. Now remember, numbers tell the truth, even when people don't. In the summer of 2006, a few months after I graduated high school, she handed me a sealed envelope over lunch. You've been helping me with the books for 3 summers. You've earned this. Inside was a document from a brokerage account. $5,000, I read aloud. Confused. It's yours, she said. Not to spend, to grow. This isn't a gift. It's a test. I remember asking, what happens if I fail? She looked straight at me. Then you'll learn what failure costs. I didn't fail. I took that $5,000 and studied everything I could about markets risk timing. I worked part-time, invested carefully, and 15 years later that $5,000 had turned into $500,000. $500,000 that carried her fingerprints more than mine. The hum of the plane engine pulled me back to the present. Daniel was asleep beside me, head tilted toward the window, his hand loosely holding mine. I stared at the clouds below and thought about the distance between who I used to be and who I had to become. When we landed in Rome, I turned my phone back on. A flood of messages appeared, mostly congratulations, a few from clients, then one from Tyler. Hey, sis, heard you're in Italy. Enjoy it while you can. Some of us are drowning back home. I deleted it without replying. That night, in a hotel room overlooking the city, I stood on the balcony, the sound of laughter and street music rising from below. Daniel came up behind me, wrapped his arms around my waist. You okay? Yeah, I said softly, just thinking. About them, I nodded. Don't, he said. You're not responsible for their choices. I wanted to believe that. But in my family, responsibility was inherited, not earned. The memory of that day in 2006 came rushing back. Grandma's hand resting on my shoulder, her voice calm but firm. Freedom starts with your bank balance, Amelia. Keep it yours. I could almost hear her now in the dark Roman air. Tyler's laughter from my childhood echoed somewhere deep in my head, followed by the image of his face on a casino website I'd once seen by accident. Flashing lights dice, rolling a grin that never reached his eyes. The next morning, as Daniel slept, I scrolled through my investment portfolio on my phone. Numbers, percentages, growth charts, all proof that Grandma's faith hadn't been misplaced. 5,000 had become 500,000. 500,000 had become my life's armor. And yet, as I looked out at the sunrise over Rome, I couldn't shake the thought that back home someone was waiting for their chance to strip it away. They called me cold, detached, ungrateful. But they never understood what it took to stay standing when the ground you grew up on kept shifting under your feet. They never knew the price of being the only one in the family who refused to drown. A week after we came back from Italy, the honeymoon was already starting to feel like a dream I'd borrowed something too fragile to belong to me. The morning sun in Austin was harsh and unforgiving when my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. Sunday, 3 p.m., family meeting. No excuses. I stared at the screen, my coffee going cold in my hand. Daniel was at the kitchen counter flipping pancakes, humming off key. When I didn't respond, he turned around. "What's wrong?" I handed him the phone. He read it and frowned. "You're not seriously going, are you?" "She'll just show up here if I don't," I said quietly. He shook his head. "You don't owe them anything, Amelia." That's the thing I said, setting down the cup. They think I always do. Sunday arrived heavy and gray, the kind of day that smelled like rain but never gave you the relief of it. We drove to Round Rock in silence. The house I grew up in looked smaller now, paint peeling on the porch, rose bushes dead along the fence. I used to think it was home. Now it just looked like a stage that had seen too many bad performances. Mom opened the door before I could knock. "You're late," she said, her lipstick too red for daylight. "It's 2 to 59, I replied. She pursed her lips. Still late. Inside, the air smelled like old bourbon and wood polish. Dad was at the dining table, shoulders straight, hands clasped in front of him like he was preparing to cross-examine someone. Tyler lounged on the couch, tapping ash from his cigarette into a glass coaster. He didn't even look up. Daniel followed me in, polite but distant. Mom gestured toward the empty chair across from her. "Sit down. We won't take much of your time." I sat, the wooden chair creaking under me. Mom started with her practiced sigh. "Tyler's gotten himself into some trouble again. The people he owes are serious this time. We've done what we could, but—" Dad interrupted, his tone smooth but sharp. "He needs help, Amelia. Just a little to get him out of the hole. You're in a position to help. We're family." I looked at Tyler. He didn't look scared. He looked bored. "How much?" I asked. 45, Dad said, but even a portion would help. 10, maybe 15. 15,000, I repeated. "You realize that's more than he's ever earned in his life." Dad's jaw tightened. "He'll pay it back." I laughed softly. Like last time, Mom leaned forward. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. We all have to pitch in sometimes." "I've pitched in my whole life," I said. "I covered Tyler's first rehab, the tuition. He never finished the car he totaled. What else is left for me to give?" "Don't be dramatic," Mom snapped. I felt Daniel shift beside me, his hand brushing my knee under the table, a small anchor in the storm. Dad's voice lowered, calm but cold. "This isn't about drama. It's about responsibility. That money you're hoarding, your grandmother's money, was never just yours. It belongs to this family. We trusted you to use it wisely." I froze. The words sliced through the room like a blade. "Never just yours." "That's not how inheritance works, Dad," I said. "It's in my name." Legally, he repeated with a bitter laugh. "You think everything is about law. What about loyalty?" Mom's voice trembled, soft but sharp. "She's become one of those women, Charles. Cold. Everything's about contracts and rules." I swallowed the lump rising in my throat. "Rules are the only reason you still have a roof over your heads." Tyler exhaled smoke, finally looking at me. "Jesus, Amelia. You always talk like you're better than us." "I'm not better," I said, steady. "Just tired of cleaning up after you." "Enough," Dad barked, slamming his hand on the table. The sound echoed through the house. "Don't forget who made you who you are. Without us, you'd have nothing." Daniel's straightened voice, calm but firm. "That's not true. Stay out of this." Dad snapped. Charles' mom warned, but he ignored her. "Daniel," I said quietly, touching his arm. "It's fine." He looked at me frustrated but leaned back. I turned to my father. You're right about one thing. Without you, I'd have less guilt, less weight to carry. He glared at me. Don't be selfish, Amelia. That money isn't even yours. The room went still. The clock in the hallway ticked loud enough to feel like thunder. I could hear my own heartbeat fast and angry. It wasn't the first time he'd said something like that, but it hit differently now. Maybe because I finally believed it was a lie. I stood pushing back the chair. You're right. It's not mine. It's what's left of Grandma's legacy. The one thing she didn't want you touching. And I intend to keep it that way. Mom's eyes filled with tears. You're tearing this family apart. No, I said softly. You already did. I'm just refusing to keep pretending it's whole. I turned to leave. Behind me, I heard my father mutter something under his breath. Maybe my name, maybe another accusation, but I didn't look back. Outside, the air was thick and hot, the kind of heat that makes you feel like you're wading through your own thoughts. I walked to the car without saying a word. Daniel opened the passenger door for me. I slid in, closed it, and stared straight ahead. He didn't start the engine right away. You okay? I nodded, though my hands were trembling in my lap. Through the windshield, I could still see the front door of my parents' house, the place that once meant home. I think I said quietly for the first time in my life, I don't owe them anything. Daniel reached for my hand. I let him hold it. The car hummed to life, and we drove away from Round Rock, the house shrinking behind us until it disappeared into the heat. By Wednesday, I was back in my office on the 19th floor of a glass tower downtown. The city below buzzed in its usual rhythm, cars honking heels, clicking on sidewalks, life moving forward. Mine, however, felt like it had stopped somewhere between anger and disbelief. I was reviewing a client's portfolio when a soft knock broke my focus. Olivia leaned against the doorframe, coffee in hand, her expression uneasy. She'd been my colleague and, for better or worse, my only real friend in this office. Got a minute? She asked. Sure, I said, motioning to the chair across from me. What's up? She hesitated, then set her coffee down. There was a notification on the internal system this morning. Someone tried to access a legacy account, one of Margaret Clark's. I froze. My grandmother's account. Olivia nodded. Yes, it's been inactive for years, right? It has. She lowered her voice. The attempt came from a residential IP address. I flagged it immediately, but you might want to check. I turned to my monitor, my fingers moving faster than my mind. Within seconds, the IP details appeared on the screen. Round Rock, Texas, my parents' zip code. The room went silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. My pulse thudded in my ears. Olivia's voice broke the silence. You okay? I'm fine, I said automatically. My voice sounded distant. Thank you for telling me. She gave me a sympathetic look. I didn't want to assume anything, but I figured you'd want to know. After she left, I sat there staring at the screen. The numbers blurred the cursor, blinking like a heartbeat. They hadn't wasted a week. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Wallace Reed, my grandmother's old accountant. It had been years since we'd spoken. When he answered, his voice was the same, measured, slightly raspy. Amelia Clark. Well, this is a surprise. I wish it were a social call, I said. Did my father reach out to you recently? A pause, then a quiet sigh. He might have. He asked a few questions about Margaret's estate. I told him everything was settled years ago. And then he hesitated again. He inquired about any unclaimed assets trusts or pending transfers. I said I wasn't authorized to discuss details without you present. Did you give him anything? Of course not, he said defensively. You know me better than that. Do I? I replied before I could stop myself. The words came out sharp. Mr. Reed, you've known my father longer than I've been alive. Loyalty can be tricky. He went quiet. I didn't say anything, Amelia. But if he's asking those questions, he's planning something. I know I said, thank you. After I hung up, I sat back and exhaled slowly, trying to steady the tremor in my hands. I felt violated, again. It wasn't just the invasion of privacy. It was the confirmation that my family saw my boundaries as optional. By the time I packed up for the evening, the city lights were flickering on below. I drove home in silence, the sound of the engine filling the spaces where thoughts should have been. Daniel was already home cooking something that smelled like rosemary and garlic. The soft light in the kitchen contrasted sharply with the noise in my head. He turned, smiling. Hey, you're late. I got caught up. He watched me for a moment, sensing it before I said anything. Work or them? Them, I admitted. He put down the spatula. What happened? I told him everything. The IP address, the call with Wallace, the creeping realization that my parents were still digging through my grandmother's financial remains like scavengers. When I finished, he leaned against the counter silent. So they're still trying to get to the money. They don't want the money, I said. They want control. They can't stand that it's mine, that I can say no. He stepped closer. You don't owe them an explanation, Amelia. You don't have to keep defending yourself. I'm not defending myself, I said quietly. I'm preparing for whatever they do next. He reached for my hand. Promise me something. What? Don't let them drag you back into that mess. You've worked too hard to climb out. I wanted to promise. I really did. But a promise like that meant staying still while they dismantled what I'd built. And I couldn't do that. Later after dinner, we sat on the couch. Daniel fell asleep with his head resting on my shoulder. The TV played low some documentary I wasn't watching. I kept replaying my father's voice from the last meeting. Don't be selfish. That money isn't even yours. I thought about my grandmother sitting at her oak desk years ago, flipping through balance sheets while I scribbled notes beside her. Numbers tell the truth, even when people don't, she'd said. Now those numbers were my truth, and my armor. I stood quietly, careful not to wake Daniel, and walked to the study. I turned on my laptop, eyes sharp despite the fatigue. If they wanted a war over control, I needed to be ready. Outside the window, the city shimmered with light reflections dancing on the glass. Somewhere below, life went on, people laughing, drinking unaware of the quiet battles fought behind office doors, and family names. I looked at my reflection in the screen. My grandmother's eyes stared back at me. When you try to protect what you love, I whispered, sometimes you have to step into the storm. And I knew then. It had already started. The following Monday, I sat in a quiet conference room that smelled faintly of polished wood and legal paper. Across from me was Annette Davis, a woman with sharp green eyes, silver-streaked hair tied in a low knot, and the calm authority of someone who had spent her life walking clients through storms like mine. Her office overlooked the Texas state capitol sunlight, bouncing off the marble dome behind her. I'd barely finished laying out my laptop, a folder of printed emails, and the log of suspicious account activity before she spoke. You said your father used to be an attorney. Yes, I said. Corporate law. Construction contracts mostly. She nodded slowly, scanning the papers. Then he knows just enough to be dangerous. The words landed hard. I watched as she flipped through the screenshots I'd taken. The IP traces the unauthorized login attempt the email my accountant confirmed. Her brow furrowed only once briefly when she reached the photo I'd taken of my grandmother's old estate file. You did the right thing documenting everything she said. These are solid. Tell me, Amelia, when was the last time you gave them access to anything financial? Never directly, I said. But after my grandmother passed, my father helped with some of the probate filings. He probably still has old passwords, maybe even copies of documents. Annette tapped her pen against the table. That would explain how they found the legacy account. When Margaret died, they likely had temporary executor rights. I frowned. Temporary, yes. Limited authority to review, not transfer or manage funds. But that authority expired years ago. Any attempt now would be considered unauthorized access. So it's illegal. She looked up, meeting my eyes. Completely. The words should have made me feel safe. It didn't. Annette leaned back in her chair. You have a few options. You can monitor and hope they stop, which they won't, or you can seal everything under a legal structure that even family can't touch. I crossed my arms. You're talking about a trust. Not just a trust, she said. An irrevocable one. Once it's set, not even you can undo it. It becomes its own entity. Untouchable, protected under its own legal identity. You'd still manage it, but the assets would no longer be personally yours. That sounds extreme. Her voice softened. It's protection, Amelia, not punishment. I looked at the papers between us. The inheritance my grandmother left her home on Lake Travis, the jewelry she'd hidden in the cedar chest, the investment portfolio she'd built over 20 years. They weren't just assets. They were her life. The proof that a woman who started with nothing could build something enduring. Still, a chill crept up my spine. If I do this, it'll feel like admitting they're my enemies. Annette folded her hands. You're not admitting anything. You're acknowledging reality. Margaret trusted you because she knew you'd protect her legacy, even if it meant protecting it from her own children. This is how you keep that promise. Her words sat in the air like truth I didn't want to face. I thought of my grandmother's last summer, her frail hands guiding mine across the ledger book, her voice calm but firm. Never give anyone the power to unmake what you've built, Amelia. Not even the ones who love you. I nodded. Okay. What do I need to do? Annette slid a thick file across the table. We'll start with a formal trust document. You'll be the grantor and trustee, but the assets. Property, investments, jewelry will transfer under the name the Eleanor Margaret Legacy Trust. You'll need notarized signatures and a secondary custodian for record oversight. I signed where she indicated. Each penstroke felt heavier than the last, like carving a line between two worlds. After the paperwork, a notary came in, a quiet woman who verified each page, stamped the blue seals, and left without a word. Annette gathered everything neatly into a single folder. There, she said. It's done. As of now, no one, not your parents, not your brother, not even you, can dissolve or claim this trust without violating federal law. I exhaled slowly. The air felt different, denser. So that's it, they can't touch anything. They can try, Annette said, smiling faintly, but they'll be staring at steel walls. I sat back. My pulse finally slowing. How much does it cover? She checked her notes. Total value of the assets transferred approximately $2.3 million. That includes the Lake Travis house, your grandmother's jewelry, and the investment accounts. You've done well, Amelia. Thanks to her, I said softly. She gave me a look that was almost kind. She'd be proud. As I left the building, the late afternoon light flooded the streets of downtown Austin. People hurried past with coffees and laptops, chasing deadlines that suddenly felt so far removed from mine. I stopped at the corner, waiting for the light to change my reflection in the glass storefront across the street. For a moment, I didn't recognize myself. The woman in the blazer, the one who just locked away her family's legacy like a vault no one could enter. By the time I reached my car, my phone buzzed in my bag. I pulled it out, expecting a message from Daniel. Instead, it was from my mother. What are you doing? Amelia, don't turn yourself into a stranger. I stared at the words until they blurred. Then I locked the screen, dropped the phone face down on the passenger seat, and started the engine. The city lights flickered on one by one as I drove. A strange calm settled over me, not joy, not triumph. Just the quiet clarity of someone who had finally closed a door. And as I drove toward home, the thought formed slowly, heavy and final. I had just locked my house and thrown away the key. It was a quiet Saturday when I decided to end the waiting. The trust papers sat in a folder on my desk for days, untouched, their blue seals staring at me like a challenge. I knew what I had to do. Pretending this was over wouldn't make it so. By noon, I was driving to Round Rock again. The same road I'd taken all my life. Past the diner with the broken sign, the gas station where Dad taught me to drive stick shift, the hill where Mom used to point out wildflowers. Every memory along that road had sharp edges now. The sky was overcast, the air heavy with Texas heat. When I parked in front of their house, the curtains were already drawn. They'd been expecting me. Dad opened the door before I could knock. His face was unreadable, his tone clipped. We need to talk. I stepped inside. The smell of old wood polish and whiskey hung in the air, same as always. In the living room, Mom and Tyler sat on the couch. Tyler was fidgeting, eyes darting between me and the man beside him. A stranger in a gray suit, mid-50s, with a portfolio on his lap. This is Robert Hill, Dad said. Our attorney. The man stood, extending his hand. Ms. Clark. I shook it firm and brief. Let's get to the point. Dad motioned toward the armchair across from him. Sit down. I stayed standing. I'll stand. He exhaled as if I'd already tested his patience. We've reviewed the situation with Margaret's estate. There's been confusion, some unnecessary tension. We just want to merge all assets under a family management plan. One structure, one signature. It'll make things simpler. Simpler for who I asked. For everyone, Mom said quickly. This isn't a fight, Amelia. It's just about doing the right thing for the family. Tyler leaned back, smirking. Yeah, you'll still have your share. Nobody's taking it away. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder, setting it on the coffee table. The sound of the clasp clicking open was louder than it should have been. You're too late, I said. Everything's been transferred to the Eleanor Margaret Legacy Trust. It's irrevocable. I'm the sole trustee. Dad frowned the faintest twitch at his jaw. Irrevocable. Yes, I said. It means you can't touch it. None of you can. Tyler stood abruptly, his voice rising. Who the hell do you think you are? You act like you built this family. Grandma did. And she'd never want you hoarding her money. I met his glare. I'm not hoarding anything. I'm preserving it, exactly the way she told me to. Mom's voice trembled. She wouldn't want us fighting like this. No, I said quietly. She'd want you to stop asking for what isn't yours. Robert Hill opened the folder, scanning the documents. He flipped a few pages, then adjusted his glasses. Everything appears legitimate. Notarized, state registered. There's nothing we can contest here. Dad's face turned a deep shade of red. That can't be right. There must be something. There isn't, Robert said. If these filings are as recent as they look, it's sealed. Mom pressed her palms together, her voice breaking. Amelia, please. We're family. You can't just lock us out. I looked at her. Her trembling hands, the way her lipstick bled into the wrinkles around her mouth. For a moment, pity tried to surface. Then I remembered every time she'd said, "You're strong, you can handle it," right before handing me another burden to carry. I didn't lock you out, I said. You shut yourselves out the moment you started treating me like a wallet. Tyler slammed his fist on the table. You don't talk to Mom like that. Sit down, Dad snapped at him, but his voice shook. I turned toward the door, then paused. You think I betrayed this family, but all I've done is draw the line you refuse to draw yourselves. Dad's eyes were dark with rage. You're ungrateful. We gave you everything. You gave me guilt, I said, and I carried it long enough. Robert closed the folder carefully and handed it back to me. Ms. Clark, he said quietly, if what you've done is what I think your legal position is airtight. Good, I said, taking it from him. Dad's voice rose again, sharp as glass. You've made a mistake. When the dust settles, you'll regret this. I faced him fully, maybe, but at least it'll be my mistake. Not yours. The silence that followed was suffocating. Mom wiped her eyes, whispering something I couldn't make out. Tyler sat back, muttering under his breath, his anger dissolving into something closer to disbelief. I walked toward the door. Dad called after me, voice low, but shaking. You're turning your back on your own blood. I stopped for just a second. Blood doesn't give you the right to drain someone dry. Then I stepped outside. The door clicked shut behind me with a sound that felt final. The afternoon sun hit my face as I walked to the car. My reflection in the window looked tired but steady. As I gripped the steering wheel, my hands trembled, not from fear but from release. I wasn't angry anymore. Just done. I started the engine, the low hum filling the silence that had followed me out of that house. They would tell people I betrayed them. They'd call me selfish, heartless, cold. Maybe they were right, but as I drove away from Round Rock for the second time, all I could think was, I had stopped just in time. Before they swallowed me whole, Monday morning came too quiet. The office lights buzzed faintly above me, a dull hum that matched the emptiness in my head. I was the first one in sitting behind my desk on the 19th floor, staring out at Austin waking up, traffic building, people rushing, lives that didn't feel heavy like mine. My computer screen glowed pale blue. I thought it was over. I thought signing those papers meant the storm had finally passed, but greed doesn't know when to stop. The phone rang just as I opened my inbox. Amelia Clark. I answered automatically. A familiar voice came through lower than I remembered. It's George. For a second, I couldn't place it. George Adams, yeah. Been a long time. His voice was cautious, like someone testing the water before stepping in. You got a minute? Sure. I leaned back. What's going on? I'm still at Parker Realty, he said. Your dad used to do some consulting for us a while back. Word going around is he's been making calls again, trying to draft some kind of family restructuring plan. My pulse picked up. A what? A restructuring plan. Asset consolidation. I don't know the details, but he hesitated. Your name's on it. I straightened. How do you know that? He lowered his voice. Because someone I trust showed me a draft. It looked like he was trying to list you as a secondary trustee, like you'd already consented. The signatures were blank, but the format looked official. My mouth went dry. Thank you, George. You did the right thing calling me. Be careful, Amelia. He knows the system better than most people. I know. I said quietly, that's what scares me. After I hung up, I sat there for a long moment, my fingers cold on the keyboard. My father wasn't just angry anymore. He was planning. When I opened my email, the first thing that caught my eye was a message from Austin Trust Bank. Account verification required. My stomach sank. The logo looked legitimate. The tone professional, the sender's address close enough to pass a quick glance. But I'd spent too many years reading fine print to be fooled. It wasn't from the bank. The subject line read, "Authorization form for secondary access approval." My phone vibrated again. Another email arrived. Same sender, different wording. A phishing attempt. They weren't just trying to guilt me into signing something. They were building a paper trail to make it look like I already had. I called Annette immediately. She picked up on the second ring. "Amelia, what's wrong?" "They're escalating," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "I just got a fake authorization email from a bank I actually use. Someone's trying to set up access under my name. Forward it to me now," she said. I could hear typing on her end. "Did you check the metadata? Yes. It's linked to an IP registered in Round Rock." Annette exhaled heavily. "Your father's using his old contacts. He's trying to create the appearance of shared management. It's subtle but dangerous. What do we do?" "We make sure no one outside your name has power of attorney or banking access. I'll contact the notary service and the registrar who filed your trust. Then I'll reach out to the bank's fraud department myself." Her voice steadied me. "You understand, Amelia, this isn't about money. This is about control. They're using the law the same way people use weapons." I pressed my hand to my forehead. "He's teaching me that lesson every day. Keep everything she said, every email, every call, every scrap of evidence. If we can prove intent, we can protect you permanently." I nodded, though she couldn't see me. "Thank you." After the call, I stared at my reflection in the black screen of my monitor. My face looked older somehow, tired, in a way sleep couldn't fix. When my father uses the law to deceive his own daughter, I whispered, he stops being a father. By evening, I couldn't sit still. I left work early and drove home. The road to the lake was quiet, lined with trees that were already turning orange with early fall. My grandmother's house, now mine, sat at the edge of the water lights, glimmering across the surface like tiny fragments of memory. When I pulled into the driveway, something felt off. The side gate was slightly open. I was sure I'd locked it that morning. My chest tightened. I parked, grabbed my bag, and walked slowly around the house. The air smelled like rain. The lock on the gate had been forced, just enough to push it open without breaking it completely. I went inside and checked the security camera feed on my laptop. Around 2:15 a.m., a tall figure appeared on the side camera, hooded, moving quickly. For a moment, I thought it was my father, but then the man looked up at the lens and I froze. Tyler. He looked thinner than I remembered, his eyes hollow in the dim infrared light. He walked up to the porch, bent down and placed something by the door. Then he left. I went to the front door. A yellow envelope sat on the mat, damp from the humidity. My name was written in slanted handwriting, his handwriting. I brought it inside, set it on the counter, and stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside were several sheets of paper. The first page had a header, "Clark Family Asset Transfer Plan." My breath caught when I saw the bottom corner. My father's signature in blue ink, clean and deliberate. The next pages detailed a proposed redistribution of property, the lake house, the investment portfolio, even the jewelry, all assigned to a family trust with my father listed as the primary trustee. My name appeared beneath it, printed neatly beside the word "authorized beneficiary." The signature next to it wasn't mine, but it looked like it. I sank onto the couch, my fingers gripping the edges of the paper. They were forging legal documents, using my name, my inheritance, my grandmother's legacy. For a long while, I just sat there staring at the envelope on the table. The house creaked in the wind, the lake outside rippling softly. When I finally stood, I locked every door, closed the curtains, and turned off the lights. In the darkness, my grandmother's portrait hung above the mantel, her gaze stern but calm. "Trust no one who asks for what they didn't earn," she used to say. I looked down at the forged papers one last time before tucking them back into the envelope. Trust, I thought bitterly, was the one thing they'd taught me to stop giving. And as I turned off the last light, the thought came sharp and cold as a knife trust once cracked never fits the same again, especially when it's worth 7 figures. The smell of garlic and butter filled the house that night, drifting from the kitchen into the living room, where I sat surrounded by papers. The lake outside reflected the last of the daylight, soft pink fading into gray. I barely noticed. My eyes were fixed on the forged documents I'd found spread across the coffee table like open wounds. Daniel stood at the stove, stirring a pot. His movements slower than usual. "You've been staring at those for an hour," he said without turning around. "You need a break." "I can't," I said quietly. "Every time I think I've seen the worst of it, they find a new way to surprise me." He sighed, setting down the spoon. "You've already locked everything down. You have a lawyer. What more do you want? I looked up at him. I want them to stop. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. And if they don't, what then they will. I said, though even I didn't believe it. Eventually, Daniel shook his head. You keep saying that, but you don't actually believe it. They're never going to stop, Amelia, not until there's nothing left for them to take. His words hit harder than I expected. So what are you saying, that I just let them? I'm saying maybe it's time to ask yourself how much more of your life you want to give to this. I didn't start it. I snapped. I know, he said, his voice soft but firm, but you're letting it define you. The air between us thickened. The sound of the pot bubbling on the stove was the only thing keeping the silence from swallowing us whole. He took a deep breath. You're building walls so high you can't even see who's on the other side anymore. I stared at the papers, my throat tight. You think I like this? You think I want to wake up every day wondering what they'll try next? No, he said, quieter now. But I think you're forgetting why you fought so hard in the first place. I didn't respond. The room felt too small, the air too heavy. After a long pause, he spoke again, his tone resigned. You're losing yourself, Amelia. The words hung there sharp and final. When he turned back to the stove, I realized my hands were shaking. Later. After dinner sat untouched on the table, I went out to the back porch. The night air was cool, the lake dark and still, except for the faint ripple of wind. Crickets chirped in the distance, a steady rhythm that made the silence louder. I wrapped my arms around myself, staring at the reflection of the moon in the water. Somewhere in that reflection, I saw my grandmother's face. The stern kindness in her eyes. Her voice came back to me like an echo. Kindness without boundaries becomes a chain. She'd said it one summer evening when I was 16, after I'd lent Tyler my savings from a summer job, so he could buy a new bike. He never paid me back. I'd cried, and she'd said, if you don't learn to say no, people will build cages out of your yes. Back then, I didn't understand. Now I did. I stayed outside for a long time, listening to the water lap gently against the dock. The stars blurred together, my thoughts just as scattered. Somewhere behind me, I heard Daniel moving around the house. Closing cabinets, turning off lights, the normal sounds of a life I felt slipping through my fingers. When I finally came inside, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, face buried in his hands. I'm sorry, I said quietly. He looked up. His eyes were tired, but not angry. You don't have to be sorry, Amelia. I just want you to find peace. I sat beside him. Peace doesn't come cheap. He gave a short laugh, one without humor. No, I guess it doesn't. We sat there in silence. The clock ticked. The wind pressed faintly against the windows. When I reached for his hand, he took it, but didn't hold it tightly. Promise me something, he said. What? When this is over, don't forget who you are, outside of all this, outside of them, outside of money. I swallowed hard. I'll try. He nodded, stood, and walked toward the door. I have an early meeting in the morning, he said, but his voice sounded far away. He stopped at the doorway, turned slightly. When you come back from whatever they're pulling you into next, make sure you're still you. Then he left the room, the soft click of the door closing behind him, louder than any argument we could have had. I lay awake for a long time, the ceiling dissolving into the dark above me. Morning crept in slow and gray. The phone buzzed on the nightstand. I didn't need to look to know who it was. I picked it up anyway. Hello. My mother's voice was gentle, rehearsed. Amelia, we need to meet. Just once more. No lawyers, no shouting. Just us. Why I asked, though, I already knew. Because we're still family, she said softly, and families talk. I closed my eyes. Where? Here, she said. Sunday. 3 o'clock. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window at the fog rolling across the lake. Daniel came in already dressed for work. Another meeting. Apparently, he frowned. Don't go. If I don't, they'll turn my silence into guilt. I said, and that's the one thing I refuse to let them weaponize. He studied me for a long moment. Then he sighed, picked up his keys, and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he looked back, his hand resting on the frame. When you come back, he said quietly, make sure you still recognize yourself. The sound of the door closing echoed through the house, leaving me alone with the papers. The silence and a question I didn't know how to answer. How much of myself I'd have left when all this was done. The clouds over Round Rock looked like they'd been painted there just to warn me. Gray, heavy, motionless. Thunder rolled somewhere far away as I parked in front of my parents' house, the same porch light flickering, even though it was still afternoon. I sat in the car for a long time, the engine running the air conditioner humming against the humidity, pressing at the windows. Beside me on the seat sat a brown folder, thin but dangerous. The security footage printed stills of Tyler sneaking into my property. Next to it was another folder, heavier, full of documents Annette had prepared. She sat in the passenger seat, calm as always, her expression unreadable. "You don't have to go in," she said quietly. "I know," I replied, cutting the engine. "But I'm tired of letting them write the story without me." The air outside felt electric the way it does before a storm. I walked up the path folder clutched to my chest. Annette followed behind me, heels clicking against the concrete. The door opened before I could knock. My father stood there, arms crossed, face set in stone. "You came," he said. "You invited me." I answered. "Good," he said, stepping aside. "We can finally clear this up." Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and something older. Resentment, maybe. My mother sat on the sofa, hands folded in her lap, face pale. Tyler was slouched in the armchair, eyes fixed on the floor. Robert Hill, their lawyer, occupied the spot nearest the window papers neatly stacked in front of him. On the table between them lay a single document, its header bold and precise. Clark Family Trust Agreement. Dad gestured to it. "Here it is. The solution to all our problems." I stared at the paper. "You call forgery a solution now?" He ignored the jab. "We just want to keep the family together. If you loved your grandmother, you'd let everyone have a share. This isn't just your legacy, it's ours. If you loved her," I said, my voice low but steady, "you wouldn't have faked documents in her name." Mom shifted, her voice breaking. "That's not what happened, Amelia. It was a misunderstanding. Tyler didn't mean any harm." I turned toward her, my jaw tightening. "So you're saying he accidentally broke into my house in the middle of the night?" She looked away. I pulled a photo from the folder and placed it on the table, an image from the security camera, Tyler's face half lit by the porch light frozen in guilt. "You want to explain this?" Tyler's head snapped up. "I just wanted to talk to you," he said, his voice cracking. In the dark. With a stolen key. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. My father's glare silenced him completely. Robert cleared his throat, his tone professional. "Miss Clark, I think there's been a series of unfortunate miscommunications. What your family is proposing is a unified financial structure, nothing more." Annette stepped forward before I could respond. Her voice was calm but razor-sharp. "That's one interpretation, but what I see is a pattern of deliberate deceit. Unauthorized access, falsified signatures, and attempted manipulation of legal instruments. I've already filed a preliminary report with the county registrar's office." My father's jaw twitched. "You think the law is going to protect you from your own family?" Annette didn't blink. "If necessary, yes." The silence that followed was suffocating. The faint tick of the wall clock filled the room. Then my father leaned forward, his voice low but shaking. "You think you can hide behind your lawyer, Amelia? You think this paper fortress you built makes you safe?" He slapped his hand on the table hard enough to make the papers jump. "I wrote contracts before you even knew what a balance sheet was. I know every loophole in the system. I didn't flinch. And that's exactly why I had to build walls. Not to keep you out, but to stop you from tearing everything down." His eyes burned. "You've turned on your family." I met his stare. "No, I've stopped pretending loyalty means obedience." Mom started crying then. Softly at first, then louder. "Please stop this. We're all we have left." "No," I said quietly. "You're all you have left. I have a choice." For a moment, nobody moved. Rain began tapping lightly against the windows, thunder rumbling closer. Robert finally stood, gathering the papers in front of him. Legally speaking, he said carefully, "There's nothing further to discuss. Miss Clark's trust is valid and binding. Pursuing litigation would be expensive and likely unsuccessful." My father didn't even look at him. His eyes were still locked on me, dark with a mix of rage and something that almost looked like loss. "You'll regret this one day." Maybe I said, "But not today." Mom buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. Tyler stared at the floor, his voice barely audible. "I didn't want it to go this far." "It already did," I said. Lightning flashed outside, throwing the room into sharp relief. The polished table, the papers scattered across it, the faces, seats of the people who used to be my family. I gathered my folder and turned toward the door. Annette followed me without a word. As I reached for the handle, my father's voice cut through the air, brittle and cold. You may have the law, Amelia, but you'll never have peace. I stopped my hand on the doorknob. Peace isn't given, Dad, I said. It's earned. Outside, the rain had started to fall in heavy drops, soaking through my jacket as I walked to the car. Annette said nothing until we were both inside. You did well, she finally said. I stared through the windshield at the house, its windows glowing faintly through the storm. That wasn't a family meeting. I said, my voice barely above a whisper. That was a courtroom without a judge. Thunder cracked in the distance as we pulled away, the house fading into the gray. 2 weeks later, I woke up to my phone vibrating against the nightstand. Dozens of notifications, emails, missed calls. The kind of noise that means bad news has found its way into daylight. When I opened the first message, the headline glared back at me in bold black letters. Austin financial advisor faces legal battle against her own parents. For a few seconds, I just stared. Beneath the headline was a picture of me from a corporate event last year. Smiling, confident, unaware, I'd one day be the villain in someone else's story. The article was vague enough to avoid defamation, but sharp enough to draw blood. Words like betrayal, greed, and family feud were sprinkled throughout. By the time I got to the office, the whispers had already started. Olivia looked up from her desk when I walked in. You saw it? I nodded. Yeah. I'm sorry, she said. People here can be curious. It's fine, I said, though it wasn't. When I reached my office, I closed the door, but the glass walls didn't keep the glances out. Through the reflection, I could see 2 analysts whispering by the coffee machine. One of them caught my eye, and turned away too late. Around noon, one of my clients, an older man named Richard Stone, who had been with me for years, came by for a review meeting. He sat across from me, tapping his pen against the folder in his lap. Amelia, he said, finally. I have to ask, is any of this true? About you taking your parents to court? I kept my voice even. I'm not suing anyone, Mr. Stone. I'm protecting a legal trust that already existed. That's all. He nodded slowly, but his eyes said something else. Hesitation, maybe even judgment. You're a strong woman. Always have been. Just be careful. These things get messy. I smiled politely. They already are. After he left, I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair. The quiet hum of the office suddenly felt hostile. In this country, when a man defends what's his, they call it integrity. When a woman does the same, they call it selfishness. Annette arrived just after 1. She walked straight in, shutting the door behind her. I've seen the article. Of course you have. I said, it's everywhere. She sat across from me. Don't respond. Don't issue a statement. Silence is strategy, not surrender. I nodded. What about them? They're talking, she said. I expected that. They want to control the narrative. But remember, public noise doesn't change legal truth. I took a slow breath. It still hurts. I know, she said, her voice softening. That's how they win, if you let it. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed again. A text from Daniel. I saw the news. I know this isn't who you are. If you need me, I'm still here. I stared at the words for a long time before typing back, thank you, then deleted it instead of sending. By evening, the story had spread beyond Austin. Local TV stations were picking it up, spinning it into something almost theatrical. Daughter versus parents, money versus loyalty. I made the mistake of turning on the television. The screen filled with my mother's face. She was sitting in what looked like her living room makeup, perfectly done voice, trembling just enough to sound sincere. She's not the same girl we raised, she told the reporter. She's changed. Now it's all about money, not family. The reporter nodded sympathetically. She's our daughter, Mom said, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. We just want her back. I turned off the TV. The room went dark except for the light from the lake outside. I sat there for a moment, letting the silence sink in. Then I whispered, You don't know me anymore, Mom. You only know the version of me you could control. Annette called an hour later. We're moving forward, she said. I'm filing a counter-motion, petitioning the court to affirm full ownership and protection of the trust in your name. Do it. I said, It might get louder before it gets quiet, she warned. I can handle loud, I said. What I can't handle is lies. The next few days blurred together. Reporters started showing up outside the office. My assistant began screening calls, turning away anyone without an appointment. Olivia brought me coffee one morning and said, "People love drama. They'll forget in a week." And I smiled faintly. I'm counting on it. On Thursday, Annette showed up unannounced carrying a small envelope. She handed it to me without speaking. I opened it. Inside was a single page from the county court, a temporary injunction order. "Effective immediately," she said. "The court has suspended any requests for access or amendments related to your grandmother's assets. Your family can't touch anything, not until a full review." I read the words twice, barely breathing. "It's not the final ruling," Annette added, "but it's a win." For the first time in weeks, my shoulders dropped, the weight easing just slightly. "Thank you," I whispered. She gave a small smile. "You earned it." After she left, I went out to the balcony. The city stretched beneath me, glowing gold under the evening sun. For the first time, I didn't feel watched or hunted, just quiet. Justice, I realized, doesn't always arrive with noise or victory speeches. Sometimes it shows up as a single page of paper in a plain envelope saying, "What you've known all along, that you were right to fight." When justice stands beside you, it doesn't have to shout. It just has to be written down. 3 months later, the heat of summer had finally broken. The maple trees around Lake Travis had turned amber and red, and the air smelled faintly of rain and wood smoke. My life had fallen quiet again. No reporters, no calls, no new letters from lawyers. Just quiet. But quiet doesn't mean peace. It just means the noise has moved elsewhere. The first piece of news came from Annette. She called one afternoon while I was organizing files at the office. "You might want to sit down," she said. I leaned against the desk. "What happened?" "It's your brother. Tyler's been arrested. Credit fraud. He tried to apply for a loan under someone else's name, used falsified documents. Your grandmother's trust among them." I felt something between disbelief and resignation. "He never learns." Annette's voice softened. "He'll be arraigned next week. Looks like the evidence is strong. I doubt he'll fight it." "Thank you for telling me," I said. After I hung up, I sat there for a long while staring at the floor. There was no satisfaction in the news, no vindication, just a slow ache that came from watching someone dig their own grave while still calling it a shortcut. A week later, I heard about my father. A headline in the Austin Business Ledger, "Former corporate counsel under investigation for insider dealings." The article was brief, clinical. He was accused of using his position years ago to manipulate land sale contracts for personal profit. Nothing proven yet, but enough for his name to stain. I didn't call him. I didn't need to. There are some lessons the universe insists on teaching without witnesses. And then there was my mother. Olivia mentioned she'd seen her once standing outside a grocery store in San Marcos. She looked thinner, she'd said, carrying a bag of apples and paying in cash. Mom had sold the Round Rock house a month earlier, quietly without announcement. She'd moved into a small apartment near the creek, the kind with beige carpet and low ceilings. The woman who once obsessed over appearances now lived in a place with peeling paint. Life has a way of humbling the proud. One Sunday I decided to drive there. Not out of pity, not out of obligation, just to close a door properly. The drive south was calm. Leaves scattered across the road like faded memories. When I arrived, the building was smaller than I'd imagined. 2 stories, weathered brick, a single oak tree shading the front steps. I climbed to the 2nd floor and knocked. After a long pause, the door opened. My mother stood there in a plain sweater, her hair unstyled. Eyes wary, but not surprised. "You found me," she said softly. "I wasn't looking," I replied. We stood there in silence until she stepped aside. "Come in." The apartment smelled faintly of detergent and dust. A small table sat by the window, a pot of wilted daisies beside it. On the wall hung an old family photo, the 4 of us smiling at some long-forgotten picnic. The faces were sun-bleached, the frame chipped. I placed a white envelope on the table. "This isn't money," I said, "just a letter. And something I thought you should have." She didn't reach for it. "What is it?" "A copy of the court's ruling. The trust is protected. It's final now." She looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. "You came here to tell me that." "No," I said. "I came here to end it." Her eyes filled, though no tears fell. "You think this makes you better than us?" "No," I said. "It just makes me free." She sank into the chair, staring at the daisies. Her hands trembled slightly. "You could have called," she said. You didn't have to make it this cold. I didn't know how to talk to you without being hurt again, I said. So I stopped trying. For a while, neither of us spoke. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. Finally, she asked, "Are you happy?" The question caught me off guard. I thought about it carefully before answering. "I'm learning how to be." She nodded, a faint, bitter smile touching her lips. "Good, maybe that's enough." I turned toward the door. My hand was already on the knob when I stopped. "Mom," I said without looking back. "You were right about one thing." She looked up. "What's that family does last forever," I said quietly. "But that doesn't mean you have to keep carrying it." When I stepped into the hallway, the air outside felt cleaner, somehow lighter. I paused by the stairwell and looked through the window at the parking lot below. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the asphalt. Before I left, something on the wall caught my eye. The old photo. Up close, the image was almost colorless now. My parents' faces had faded first, the edges blurred and ghostly. My own face somehow remained clearer. I reached out and traced it with my finger. For a second, I felt the sting of nostalgia, then let it go. Some memories are better when they fade. Back in the car, I sat for a moment listening to the steady beat of my heart over the hum of the engine. Karma isn't revenge. It's balance. The slow correction of what's been thrown off course. As I pulled out of the lot, the sun broke through the clouds lighting the road ahead, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was driving away. I felt like I was finally going somewhere. The afternoon sun filtered through the bare branches outside my window, casting slow-moving shadows across the porch. Winter in Texas never really felt like winter, but that day the air was crisp enough to bite. I sat on the back deck of the lake house, a wool blanket draped across my lap, the steam from my tea curling in the light. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like something I had to survive. It felt earned. Inside, the fire hummed low in the stone hearth. The house had taken on a different kind of warmth since autumn, less haunted, more lived in. I'd painted the study, boxed up old memories, rearranged the furniture. A new beginning that still smelled faintly of the past. My laptop sat open beside me on the porch table. It had become my quiet ritual every Sunday afternoon. Check the trust accounts, the property filings, the encrypted access logs. Annette had set up a system so tight, not even the IRS could peek without knocking first. Still, I liked seeing the numbers myself, the columns of balance sheets, each one a reminder that what my grandmother built was safe. Everything looked steady. The Eleanor Margaret Legacy Trust sat untouched, sealed, exactly as it was meant to be. My phone buzzed with a text. It was Annette. All documents finalized, probate closure complete. No remaining appeals or claims. It's officially over. I read it twice, the words sinking in like warmth through cold skin. It was over. I set the phone down and let out a long breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The lake shimmered in the distance, a few ducks drifting near the reeds. I thought of my grandmother again, her steady hands guiding mine across her old ledger, her quiet insistence that numbers never lie. Even when people do, I whispered softly into the cold air. "We did it, Grandma." Then, as if on cue, my laptop chimed. A new email notification blinked in the corner of the screen. The sender's name stopped me cold. Charles Clark. Legal inquiry. For a moment, I just stared at it. The address was one I hadn't seen in months. My father's old business account, the same one he'd used for years, when he still thought he could outsmart everyone. My pulse kicked up not from fear this time, but from the dull amusement that comes when you see a ghost trying to haunt what it no longer owns. The subject line read, "Request for Access Beneficiary Review." I clicked it open. The message was short. Authorization required to update existing trustee permissions. Please verify ownership to proceed. It looked official. Almost. But I'd seen this before. The headers were wrong, the formatting slightly off. A forged attempt, clumsy this time. I could practically hear his voice behind it, frustrated and desperate, trying one last time to breach what he'd already lost. A small laugh escaped me. Not bitter, not angry, just tired and done. I moved my cursor to the top right corner and clicked block permanently. A confirmation popped up on the screen, bold white letters on a dark background. Access denied. I leaned back in my chair, letting the moment settle. The phrase looked colder than it felt. That was the same message they must have seen the first time they tried to break in months ago, when Annette's protections sealed the trust. I'd imagined their faces then, shocked, frozen, realizing too late that the door they'd kicked open their whole lives was finally closed. Now, staring at those words, I didn't feel the same rush of triumph I once did. Just peace. Simple, unremarkable peace. The screen dimmed after a while, and I closed the laptop. The quiet around me felt deeper somehow, not empty but whole. I heard the crunch of gravel behind me and turned. Daniel was walking up from the driveway, coat collar turned against the wind. He'd been gone for the weekend, visiting his sister in Dallas. When he reached the porch, he smiled that slow, cautious smile of someone who wasn't sure if they were still welcome. "Hey," he said gently. "How's it been?" "Quiet," I said. "The good kind." He nodded, stepping closer. "You look lighter." "Maybe I am." He sat beside me, the boards creaking under his weight. His hand brushed mine, hesitant but warm. "Annette called me," he said. "Said it's over. It is." I said, "No more appeals, no more signatures, no more anything." He looked out toward the water, the late sunlight catching in his hair. "So what now?" I smiled faintly. "Now I just live." He was silent for a moment, then turned to me. "Do you ever wish it had gone differently?" I thought about that. The nights spent arguing, the emails, the betrayals, my father's voice calling me selfish, my mother crying on television, Tyler's face blurred in a mugshot. "I used to," I said, "but not anymore." "I don't need an apology to move on." Daniel nodded slowly. "You really mean that?" I met his eyes. "Yeah, I just want quiet." He smiled, reaching over to place his hand on my shoulder. "Then you finally got what you wanted." I looked back at the lake, the water catching fire in the orange light of sunset. For years I'd thought winning meant being proven right, being justified, being seen. But sitting there listening to the stillness around me, I realized something simpler. Winning isn't about being loved. It's about not needing to prove you deserve it anymore. I finished my tea, its warmth fading, but still comforting. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of wind brushed through the reeds. When Daniel went inside, I stayed a little longer, watching the light fade over the lake, until the world turned the same color as forgiveness, soft, quiet, and real. If you've ever been called selfish just for protecting your peace, remember this family doesn't mean surrender. Some doors are meant to stay closed. Eros denied.